Hey, this is Dr. B, your nerdy criminal justice professor, and it is Sunday, January the 25th, 2026. As I look out my window over here, I can see a lot of rain falling. It's a very fine mist of a rain, but it still is a lot of water coming down, um, and it's causing a lot of ice in the trees. So I hope everyone is keeping safe because it's going to freeze overnight. So be very, very careful while you're going out. You might be reading this video watching this video after this weather's all done, but um, the sentiment is the same. All right, so we are going to talk a little bit about supplemental material to Chapter 2 in the Brent Turvey book titled Criminal Profiling. Now, in this chapter, Turvey talks about logic. Now, one of the sections in this chapter is called Science as Falsification. So, I think it's important that you hear a little bit about the falsification principle in science. Um, very few students who are not science students, meaning they don't major in one of the science fields, rarely hear about the principle of falsification in science or the philosophy of science. So Karl Popper was a science philosopher. Thomas Kuhn was also a science philosopher. Thomas Kuhn wrote a book entitled The Nature of Scientific Revolutions. So the paradigm shift term came from that book. Unfortunately, people adopted that term and didn't realize that paradigm shifts are truly rare. But so that book was published in the 60s. Well, prior to that, Karl Popper was writing. And he wrote several books on that encompass the philosophy of science. But Popper developed the idea of the principle of falsification. Now, he didn't create the principle. He simply looked at science and the way people were doing science, especially quantum physics, and he noticed some things. Now, he actually compared Einstein with Freud. So as he looked at Einstein and Freud, one of the things he noticed was that Freud never accepted that any of his hypotheses might be wrong. So he came up with hypotheses. Okay, so remember, in science, we have a hypothesis, we create a hypothesis, we collect the data, we analyze the data, and then we make our conclusions from that data analysis. Well, Popper basically said Freud doesn't do that. He simply makes his hypothesis and then he presents case studies to prove his hypothesis. But then he said, well, let's look at Einstein. Einstein will have a hypothesis and he'll try his best to falsify his hypothesis. That is, Einstein will try his best to disprove his hypothesis. So Freud says, well, I think this is true. Now I'm going to prove it. Einstein says, I think this is true. Let me see if I can disprove this. So Einstein was the honest scientist, and Freud was not, if we use Popper's observations of the philosophy in making that determination. This principle is so important in criminal profiling because in the years that I've read all these works about criminal profiling, all these quote studies that weren't true science anyway, When I look at the way that the FBI went and they interviewed a small number of criminals already in prison, and they took them at their word, okay, to develop a lot of how they write the profiles, it became clear to me that the FBI had ignored the principle of falsification. In other words, they were using more of the Freudian method than the Einsteinian method. They were simply having their hypothesis, and then they would go out and look for evidence to support that. And that's the only evidence they would look at. By the way, we call that cherry picking the data, meaning we'll only take data that supports our conclusion that we want to be supported. That's bias. That's confirmation bias in research. But the profilers, when they would write a profile, they would do the same thing. So, for instance, John Douglas once said that some unknown serial killer would have a lisp or a speech impediment of some sort. Well, that doesn't help with anything. That doesn't help an investigator do anything. Are we just going to gather up everybody in the US that has a speech impediment and then start to rule them out one by one? We're talking about tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. That is not a true scientific method. But when the actual perpetrator was caught with no help from the profile, John Douglas said, I said he would have a speech impediment. And in the end, that was a lucky guess. And that's all it was. But I also want for everyone to think about the Norfolk Four. These are four sailors, lowest level. They were at the rank of seaman. Um, and they were all convicted of a murder that they had absolutely nothing to do with. Because, and this is in Norfolk, Virginia, but what happened was that someone that lived in the apartment complex with one of the defendants that was wrongly convicted and the victim told the lead investigator when the body was first found and the police arrived on the scene that this particular sailor was obsessed with the woman who had been murdered, raped and murdered. That lead investigator then simply bought that and believed that that sailor did it. So when that sailor came home from dinner and his parents were there and his wife had just come home from the hospital, he was helping her, taking care of her post surgery. So when he came home from dinner with his wife and his parents, that police officer said, "Would you mind coming down to the police station and let us talk to you?" And he said, "Sure, anything to help you solve this crime. I'm more than happy to do that." He didn't know he was a suspect. They then interrogated him for several hours using the Reed technique. Now, the Reed and Associates say that it wasn't the Reed technique, but the officers believed they were using the Reed technique. I'm not going to get into their dispute as to whether or not it was being used or not, but they were using at least some combination or an adaptation of it. And after hours of interrogation with in a room with no stimuli, with no food and very little water, they started showing him photos of the crime scene and started, so they got him ungrounded. And by the way, he had borderline intellectual functioning, which means he was easier to intellectually manipulate. So they showed him pictures and said that the family needs to have some closure. So they convinced him to confess. And then they collected his DNA. And when the DNA came back, guess what? It was not a match to him. So they interrogated him again and got him to give up another name. Because rather than buying the fact that maybe we use coercive interrogation tactics to get a confession, Rather than saying maybe that was true, no, that lead investigator said, no, this person thought that he was obsessed with her. He has to be the killer. So something else has to have happened. We know he had a co-defendant, and that the co-defendant is the one that raped her and he killed her. So they got him to give up a name. So they did the same thing to that second person, that who, by the way, also had borderline intellectual functioning. That person then confessed. They got their DNA. DNA came back, not a match. Now, you'd think at this point, the lead investigator would say, man, I've really screwed up. Maybe we've been going down the wrong trail. No. Well, we've got two confessions. Nobody would ever confess to something they didn't do, period. So they bring that second guy in and interrogate him again. And he gives up a third name. Well, let's repeat that same thing with that third guy. Same thing. DNA doesn't match. You'd think a third time they would say, man, we really screwed up. No. So they got that third person to give up a fourth name. Well, when they get the fourth person doesn't have borderline intellectual functioning, and they refused to confess. Oh, they charged him anyway, and all four of them were convicted. All four of them won major cash, by the way, from the state of Virginia. They finally caught the actual killer, a serial rapist, serial rapist who also had killed some of his victims. Not enough to be classified yet at the point that he went to prison as a serial killer, but he was already in prison, and it took years before there was somebody finally put the DNA together and found who the real killer was. Now, what happened? That lead investigating officer, she got herself anchored to a hypothesis. And rather than realizing I'm going to go collect evidence to try my best to prove he didn't do it, and if I can't prove he didn't do it, then it's a possibility he did, so then let me get evidence of that. No, didn't have any physical evidence to link him, but just believed he was guilty. And so, literally, the first night the police were there, within 48 hours, he was confessing. Um, you don't solve that kind of a murder that way. But what this person did was they got stuck. They got stuck in their own hypothesis, and they were going to prove it by hook or by crook. They cherry picked the data, and when the DNA evidence did not support their hypothesis, they just decided it's unimportant. It doesn't belong. So as you go through chapter 2 of Turvey's book, I want you to keep that in mind. Also keep that in mind as you read the introduction material in the crime classification manual. So be aware of that. All right, I've already gone a little longer than I wanted to, so we'll see you next video.